Thank you very much for this introduction. It'll be hard to live up to it, but thanks especially for reminding me of my history in the involvement with mnemonics. I had no idea that I had a role in that before. Anyway, good to know. I want to thank especially Astrid Ertl and her wonderful team for organizing this and for having invited me to come back to mnemonics after having done other work for a number of years. But I certainly do remember conferences in Copenhagen and Aarhus and in Ghent, the city of some of my ancestors actually, which you might have gathered from the name. And I'm delighted to be back within the mnemonics context to give you a slice of a new project that I'm planning to, if time is granted, to complete within the next few years. At a critical time when the EU and liberal democracies are threatened by a wave of resurgent nationalisms, racisms, and increasing attacks on gender and sexual rights, it may seem frivolous to begin this conference on the social life of memory with a talk about the arts. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. As I remain committed to searching for successful mergers of aesthetics and politics in contemporary culture, I would argue that the social life of memory must include a transnational, if not planetary, affective politics that can be embodied and developed in artistic practices. Why in art rather than in memorials, museums, memory sites? Memorial sites like the ESMA in Buenos Aires or the Topography of Terror in Berlin, museums like the Santiago Museo de Memoria y Derechos Humanos or the 9/11 Memorial Museum in New York focus exclusively and inevitably on the local dimensions of the events they commemorate. Of course, such sites also include universalizing ethical demands such as nunca más. But the mediation of local and national memory with a potential planetary dimension of the social life of memory is perhaps best addressed in the work of artists. Now, in this talk, I want to speak about the work of three artists from beyond the northern transatlantic, whose memory work is resolutely local, but radiates effectively and aesthetically into transnational spheres of reception, not due only to its thematic content, but primarily because of the aesthetic strategies these artists use. At a time when the boundaries of European citizenship are challenged both from the inside and the outside, those boundaries cannot be equated with the imaginary boundaries of European memory. The boundaries of citizenship, of course, must be legally, administratively, and politically defined. But European memory cannot be. It cannot be culturally fortressed. For what is European memory if it does not include memories of Europe's role in the world at large? It must acknowledge reciprocally the memories of Europe as they circulate elsewhere, and now increasingly also on the inside. Now, some years ago, conference titles such as Europe and Its Others abounded, still fundamentally Eurocentric in spirit with its possessive pronoun and the globalizing discourse of othering. Then the language changed, acknowledging the implicit problem and turning to phrases such as Europe in other cultures, a discourse that recognized counter-strategies of writing back to empire. Europe itself was being othered by its others, or, as Dipesh Chakrabarty called it, provincialized. From my point of view, both views are inadequate today to capture how the imaginary relationship between Europe and non-European parts of the world is structured in the work of contemporary artists. It is particularly the transnational and by now globally extant discourse of political memories of violence, state terror, and ethnic cleansing that has produced artistic memory practices in which the European and the non-European are indissolubly folded into each other. Today, neither the discourse of othering nor that of provincializing makes much sense any longer. Excuse me for a second, I gotta get my water. Now, of course, the national has never lost its hold in the social life of memory and its cultural imaginaries. Identitarian thinking is still well and alive. Theodor Adorno, over half a century ago, already gave a succinct analysis when he said, "Nationalism today is both obsolete and up to date." At a time when we experience a delusional renationalization of politics, not only in Europe, it is all the more important to take account of practices in the arts which can open up an alternative horizon. Practices that may teach us to be in the world in a non-identitarian way, to be European and planetary at the same time in our practices of remembrance. Now, I would like to speak about three contemporary artists whose work originated outside of the Western art world, but has become exceptionally successful within it, both in the US and in Europe. William Kentridge, Doris Salcedo, and Vivan Sundaram. All three are exemplary in that they weave together two separate strands of memory: memories of local histories of violence and emphatic memories of European modernism, which they appropriate and transform in creative ways. Their work tells us a great deal about how memories of Europe are an integral part of the very texture of artistic work from elsewhere. Kentridge, Salcedo, and Sundaram work in multiple media and genres, from gallery, sculpture, performance, and public event to black box film, theater, opera, not to speak of painting and drawing. Installation and mise en scène are central to their work, which is deeply embedded in local histories. South African apartheid in Kentridge, Colombian violencia in Salcedo, British colonialism and Hindu nationalism in Sundaram. But their political memory work is also self-consciously informed by an appropriation in reverse, as one could call it, a transformative appropriation of major moments of European and American modernism. In Salcedo, it is minimalist sculpture, installation art, and hermetic post-45 German poetry, Paul Celan especially. In Kentridge, German expressionism, Soviet avant-gardism, and early techniques of stop-motion animation film. And actually, Aleida Assmann just told me she just saw a production by Kentridge at the Salzburger Festspiele of Büchner's Wojciech. In Sundaram, it is installation art and the critical Umfunktionierung, refunctioning of a colonial memorial site. Their relation to a much broadened understanding of modernism is anything but derivative. They prey liberally on Western modernism as global resource. What makes this work different from much of what goes for contemporary art in the international art markets is that political and aesthetic issues are being worked through without apology at a time when the successful linking of aesthetics and politics seems more like a rumor of the past than a reality in the present. Their work remains resolutely local, but as successful artists from the quote-unquote periphery, immersed in transnational trends, they cannot be treated merely as local informants. The work thus poses important questions pertaining to transcultural reception and global effects beyond borders. So let me begin with Salcedo. I will not talk here about her signature work from the 1990s that deals in powerful ways with the Colombian violence, the multi-decade-long civil war involving the military, death squads, the FARC guerrillas, and narco gangs. Her sculptural installations of violently disfigured and subtly worked over furniture represent a kind of memory art which hovers between abstraction and emotional pull that deeply unsettles spectators into uncanny recognition. Now, in more recent years, and now I focus on work by her that deals more with European issues, the geographic horizon reflected in Salcedo's work has considerably broadened beyond Colombia toward Turkey, Italy, the UK, and the US. Simultaneously, her work has moved increasingly from gallery and museum space into public space and site-specific urban installations, both in Colombia and abroad. But the meticulous attention to laborious detail has remained. For instance, the use of empty chairs, symptomatic of disappearances from the private domestic sphere in her early work on Colombia, is turned toward public urban space in one public project entitled November 6 and 7. It commemorates a guerrilla siege of Bogotà's Palace of Justice that was violently ended when the army stormed the building in November 1985. On the 17th anniversary of that siege, 2002, some 280 wooden chairs were lowered from the roof of the Palace of Justice, one each for each of the victims. Salcedo remained faithful to the forensic reports and sequenced the chairs according to spatial and temporal coordinates of the siege itself. The images of chairs dangling outside the facade of the government building and casting their shadows for all to see in that central square in Bogotá received major attention and triggered a public debate on a conflict that 17 years after the event was still not resolved. Now, 1 year later, in 2003, in her contribution to the 8th International Istanbul Biennial, Salcedo chose an empty space between two buildings in Istanbul, filling it with approximately 1,550 wooden chairs, stacked tightly between the two buildings, framing the installation on either side. Again, site specificity was key. Once there had been a building here, in this formerly Greek and Jewish neighborhood in Istanbul, now rather derelict and spotted with similar empty lots and ruins. Again, the empty chairs conjure absence. Absence in this case related to migration, displacement, and violent expulsion that took place over many years. But look at the precision with which the chairs are arranged to suggest a flush facade when looked at from the side, and a chaotic, disorganized jumble if viewed frontally. As in the early work, the human body is absent, present only in the trace. The installation lasted only for 3 months, once the biennial closed, different from that other missing house installation created in Berlin's Große Hamburger Straße, center of Eastern Jewish immigration around 1900 by Christian Boltanski, an installation from 1989 still visible today and certainly one of the canonical works of a site-specific installation in Germany. As opposed to Salcedo, Boltanski has left the space of the missing house empty, but in painstaking research, he had found the names, professions, and dates of birth and death of the Jewish and non-Jewish renters who had lived in the building during the Third Reich before it was destroyed in a bombing attack in 1945. These names and data were then put on signs fixed to the outside walls of the adjoining buildings at the appropriate level where the renters' apartments would have been. Boltanski and Salcedo, two very different yet resonating ways of mobilizing absence in urban space to give testimony of its hidden history, its submerged social memories. Istanbul and Berlin, the comparison points to the multidirectionality of artistic memory projects today. Now, site specificity also characterizes Shibboleth, a work from 2007 executed in the Tate Modern in London. Overcoming initial opposition by the museum officials, Salcedo cut deep at points widening, at others bifurcating or narrowing crack into the floor of the huge turbine hall, now the entrance space to this vast museum, which served formerly as an energy plant. If Gordon Matta Clark in the 1970s cut and split houses in his Architectural Experiments, Salcedo split in two one of the major sites of contemporary art in Europe. But the gesture was more than merely architectural. The title gives a clue. Shibboleth is the biblical word from the book of Judges 12 that cannot be pronounced correctly by foreigners trying to cross the Jordan River into safety. Recognized as other by their pronunciation, they are killed on arrival. The theme of immigration as exclusion and denial of rights is articulated in the Tate's Turbine Hall. It reverberates not only socially, but as a mark in the museum, also aesthetically, in that it points to a structure of exclusion in the canonization of modernist art itself. It conjures up a history of European modernism which until very recently has refused to acknowledge or to allow in modernisms from Africa, Asia, Latin America. Inserted into the concrete walls of the crevice of Shibboleth, and only perceptible once you bend over the crack, is steel mesh fence, not the barbed wire of Nazi or Serbian camps, the steel mesh of today's border fortifications. Concrete walls, of course, are intended to keep the barbarians outside, whether in Israel or at the Mexican-American border. The pronunciation of a word divides the world into friend and foe with deadly consequence. Biblical past and the contemporary present clash in this work that reflects in powerful visual and architectural language on the continuities between colonialism, racism, and immigration. What better place to do this than that major London Museum of Contemporary Art on the banks of the River Thames? Today, the crevices are no longer there. They have been filled with cement. But the outline, the victory, I presume, of the museum officials who didn't want to have a crack there in the first place. But the outline of the crack is still visible all along the turbine hall. It's like a scar of the wound Salcedo had inflicted on the Tate Modern. A wound, however, that really is a wound in Europe's constitution itself, as daily reports of migrants fleeing Africa or the Middle East remind us. Vivan Sundaram, an Indian bricolage and installation artist indebted to the traditions of Soviet constructivism, combined with a politically turned minimalism, can be compared to Salcedo in that he too developed Western installation art in a non-Western context. Like Salcedo, inscribing an archival and historical impulse into his projects. Like Salcedo, and yet very differently. In the 1993 Memorial, which was his first major installation, later reworked and expanded, and the images I'm showing here is from that later expanded version. It is a complex work dealing imaginatively with the 1992 Gujarat Hindu violence on Muslims, in which the current Indian president, Narendra Modi, played an ignominious role. The spark plug for this installation was a newspaper photograph of an anonymous Muslim man lying slain in a Bombay street in front of a toppled garbage container and clutching a small bundle of his possessions in the hollow of his tortured body. When I first saw it exhibited in Bombay in the 1990s, it felt like an entombment, somewhere between minimalism and arte povera, but uncannily moving in its dialectic of affect and abstraction. Sundaram had constructed a path for the visitors through the memorial toward a gateway of brown tin trunks resembling many an Indian memorial. The piece was first exhibited in a small gallery in the same neighborhood where the man had become victim of mob violence. The work is different from Salcedo's gallery sculpture in that a real document, the photograph, was central for the installation. But Sundaram did use similar strategies of creating an alternative view on events through remembrance and mourning via found and constructed objects, that blended distancing abstraction with immediate effect. And here are a few more images of the pieces surrounding this path through the memorial. I mean, this figure here, for instance, resembling the sculptures of somebody like Segal. Now, visually most powerful in this work are Sundaram's multiple transformations of the newspaper image, which suggest a traumatic impact the photo may have had on the artist. Pierced by nails or covered up by them, the victim's body on the photograph was placed at ground level in small vitrines to be looked at from above. A few more images here. Analogous to Salcedo's work, the violence of the present it conjures up is the result of a historical trauma that reaches all the way back here to the Indian partition of 1947, one of the major bloodlettings of the 20th century, but still largely repressed. Now, in the late 1990s, Sundaram expanded the archival dimension of his work with his history project, the second of his work that I want to talk about here. He took a monument of British imperialism, the Victoria Memorial Museum in Calcutta, still a major museum and tourist attraction today, and refunctioned it into a counter-monument by inverting its inherent colonial meanings from the position, his position, of the post-independence secular Indian state. All this happened actually with state support. Hard to imagine that this could happen today still. It happened with state support at the time, at the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Indian independence. With a wealth of media and objects, he created an open-ended archive of Bengali history and its struggle for modernity, focusing on working class and peasant uprisings, as well as on classically modern Bengali culture. His strategies in refunctioning the museum involved a railroad track traversing the main hall. I'll give you a set of images now. The railroad, of course, being a major cipher for modernity. A railroad wagon, perversely with rubber tires, as in this image. A trolley loaded with a metal boat. A pile of jute bags, jute being a material used for clothing. A red plastic chair as a fake throne with an enlarged image of Queen Victoria in the background. A library of box files representing rebels against colonialism and the struggle for a Bengali modernity up until the chaotic end of colonialism. Quotes by classical Bengali writers written into the cupola of the massive building. A cast iron printing press on which small publications of resistance were published, plus cabinets and vitrines, photographs and audiovisual materials, and so forth. Critical history is powerfully inscribed into this counter-memory project, which as a temporary exhibition written over a public building could be compared to Salcedo's work on Bogotá's Palace of Justice. The difference is clear, though. Archival materials are worked through carefully by Salcedo, but feature only indirectly in the completed work. Salcedo remained more closely tied to the conceptual and minimalist dimension of post-1960s art practices, while Sundaram extends the conceptual constructivist dimension to the explicitly archival. If a parallel to drama may be allowed here, I would say that Sundaram's strategies are closer to Heiner Müller's rhetoric of Überschwemmung in his drama, a rhetoric of flooding of images, than to those of Samuel Beckett's reduction of dramatic devices. But what results in Sundaram is a much stronger narrativization of counter-memory, requiring intense interpretive labor from the spectator. In both cases, though, the architecture of an existing building provided the material support for the installation. As in the work of Nalini Malani, an Indian feminist artist who focuses on the violence of the partition and about whom I've written elsewhere, there is a new and felicitous combining here of the aesthetic with the political, nurturing the social life of political memory in India and beyond. The History Project demanded a synchronous, immersive experience combined with the recognition of lived history as laid out in diachronic narrative of archival objects, scripts, sounds, film footage. In Mika Baal's words, these works by Salcedo and Sundaram are acts of memory, enabling and demanding cognitive and affective participation from their visitors. However, they may or may not change politics in a narrower sense, they certainly create a significant space for what Armin Ash and Nigel Thrift have called the affective life of politics in their book, Arts of the Political, a book actually which doesn't deal with the arts at all. In the installation of Salcedo and Sundaram, the institutional critique, so dominant in Western postmodernism of the 1970s, expands beyond gallery and museum, which were central targets of institutional critique at that time. It expands here toward the institutions of public political life itself, which are, as it were, set in motion through bricolage and opened up for critique. Now, colonial and post-colonial violence are also central to William Kentridge's work. At the same time, there is a structure of weaving the local into the transnational or global, analogous to Salcedo's work. Of course, significant differences pertain between post-colonialism and thus the image of Europe in Africa or Asia versus Latin America. Kentridge addresses the politics of colonial rule much more directly than Salcedo does. Central to his work on media memory is the shadow play, as in the Shadow Procession of 1999, a three-part stop-motion animation film which evoked apartheid and post-apartheid times in South Africa. I wish I could have shown a piece of that in a clip, but I thought...
It does work.
No, it's another clip. This is an earlier work. I'll show the clip later on. But I thought there might not be time. Anyway, so if you haven't seen that, I mean, I think much of it is actually available online. It's an absolutely fantastic work. Now, over a decade later, after 1999, he created another procession in a work entitled The Refusal of Time, a stunning black box installation first shown in a dilapidated former railway building at Documenta 13 in 2012. In this project, South African memory politics broadens out into an investigation of modern regimes of time and of space. Relevant here are the historical conferences, the Greenwich Meridian Conference in Washington, 1884, and the Berlin Colonial Conference of that same year. Now, these regimes of time and space, of course, still rule our world today. Kentridge, on the other hand, inspired by Einstein's special theory of relativity of 1905, evokes the instability and reversibility of time itself. As Einstein argued against earlier physics, there is no universal absolute time, no universally audible tick-tock, only a multiplicity of times. And this multiplicity, politically theorized by Ernst Bloch as non-synchronicities within modernity, is enacted in Refusal of Time, and it has far-reaching implications for art and politics in our still very modern age. Now let me backtrack a bit here. In a deliberate anti-Platonic move, Kentridge has always challenged his viewers to learn from the shadows, from the black that opposes and pervades the white. the darkness that comes with the light. All memories are plagued by shadows and by the insecurity of remembering. They can be fleeting, elusive, subject to metamorphosis, as we all know. They often border on the invisible and the forgotten. To be articulated in art, they will need embodiment in objects and in media, visual, verbal, musical. But their embodiment cannot be solid and fixed, nor can it be limited to one medium. Memorized events cannot be represented in a mimetic fashion. They are inherently haunted by the limits of representation. Realism as an effect has to flow from the construction and manipulation of objects, as in Salcedo's sculptures and installations, or as in Kentridge's shadow plays. But Kentridge works on invisibility, even more radically than Salcedo, not just on the invisibility or fading of events to be grieved, but on the invisibility and instability of time itself. That is why the refusal of time as an anti-colonial act directed against an imposed European regime is central to all of his work, and why its narrative montage culminates in another shadow procession at its end, which I will show a little later on. Now first, a few words about this installation, this black box which you see in this image here. It is a black box with projections moving from left to right on 3 walls. Spectators entering the black box first encounter a huge breathing machine. Kentridge calls it the elephant in the back of the room. The rhythmically moving machine, made up of moving wooden parts, resembles a pump or a large loom, and it fills the black box with its clanking noises and its ever louder exhalations. It embodies both the breath of the human body and the pneumatic pumping of time used in late 19th century Paris to coordinate time across the city's clocks. Bellowing like an elephant, it combines the organic and the mechanical dimensions of time regimes and their measurements. Several image sequences of the refusal of time remind us of Méliès's early film techniques and its visual trickeries, which were already explicit in some of Kentridge's earlier work. Reiteration is, after all, one of his major creative techniques. In clear reference to Méliès's melodramatic shorts, Peter Gallison, Kentridge's collaborator, a science historian from Harvard, thus called Refusal of Time a, quote, metaphysical melodrama about time, reversibility, and fate, end quote. Now the image sequence begins with a ticking metronome. You see it here in the background on the walls, with a ticking metronome that is then multiplied on the 3 walls of the black box and increasingly loses its beat, either speeding up or slowing down. The spectator wonders whether the multiple metronomes tick at different speeds, but then recognizes that the film is simply sped up for some and slowed down for others. Film and Einstein are simultaneous, early 20th century. The effect, at any rate, is loud chaos and metronomes out of control, a first instance of the refusal of an orderly progressing time. And it is film itself as a medium that reveals how time is out of joint. As medium, it makes the relativity of time visible. Now, ticking metronomes and clocks of all kinds are projected throughout onto the walls, with clock hands moving chaotically forward or backward, representing time at the most palpable and unpredictable level. Then there are several repetitive slapstick-like sketches of a love scene, a man in a globe, as in this one here, a man in a globe-like vestment, Kentridge himself doubled up and messing slapstick-like with reality. As in early cinema, reverse projection is used to make things run backward in time. Books thrown, flying back into the hands of the thrower. The shattering of objects being undone as they are restored to their original wholesome state. One of the key ciphers here, as always in other Kentridge's work, is a coffee pot being dissolved and then reconstructed on the screen. Drawing liberally on late 19th and early 20th century experiments to discipline, measure, and control time, especially in the industrial world, time is revealed here not just in its relativity, but in its ability to wreak havoc. And then the politics. Greenwich time and the measurement of the world are presented as European techniques of domination, calling forth active resistance. Thus, in one of the sequences of the projections that cover 3 walls of the black box, a primitive bomb cocktail is mixed in a laboratory that features various objects known from Kentridge's earlier films. In this visual narrative, the anarchist bombing of the Royal Observatory in Greenwich of 1894 is transposed fictionally to colonial Dakar in 1916. But here, the homemade bomb blows up the laboratory itself, which simultaneously functions as the artist's studio. The revolt against Greenwich time is then coded as an anti-colonial refusal of an imposed regime of time and simultaneously as an aesthetic project. The refusal of linearity and one-directionality of time, as they characterized ideologies of progress, has always been a central principle of modern artistic practice, but in Kentridge it is mobilized in direct relation to colonialism and its imposition of a new regime of time and space. In another sequence, Kentridge ironizes the white man's burden. The film projected onto the walls shows him carrying a black woman on his shoulders. It appears together with African maps interspersed with newspaper headlines such as Revolt in Burundi, Revolt of the Hereros, etc., pointing to colonial violence and rebellion. And then, as beneficiary of white rule in a self-critical gesture, he arranges a sequence of chairs in such a way that an African woman can step comfortably from one to the other, while he frantically brings the respectively last chair she stepped on to the front of her march so that she can move ahead. Female African figures play an important role in this installation, as in Kentridge's earlier films, and they might, call up some critical kind of comments legitimately, I think. But it's an interesting technique that he uses over and over again. Now, one high point in the bombing scene that I mentioned, right after the explosion, for instance, is an exuberant dance by one of his major artists of an African woman in flying white gowns. A dance that proceeds in reverse motion. It is filmed, of course, in reverse motion with white pieces of paper rising around the dancer. This exuberant dance in white offers a life-affirming counterpoint to the Shadow Procession at the end of Refusal of Time that culminates with black confetti whirling upwards until they cover the whole screen. Though here the procession consists of real human figures rather than black paper cutouts, as in that film I mentioned earlier from 1999, they also carry objects of everyday life. These figures carry objects of everyday life with them as they trudge on forward. Several musicians leading the procession play an anarchic rhythmic tune on wind instruments, tuba, trumpet, and trombone, accompanied by drumming as they march to the rhythm in the procession. The use of wind instruments joins the bellowing of the mechanical elephant. Rhythms and sounds come alive in accord with human breath, which can never be subjected to a strict metrical regime. And yet, this shadow procession does not end in open-ended surreal anarchy, as the Shadow Procession of 1999 did, but it ends in the black confetti covering the whole screen until everything has been swallowed up as if in a black hole or by a black hole. Now let me see. I may need some help to get, because I don't work with a Mac. I want to show a clip now which will show the Shadow Procession. As I said, a Shadow Procession now with real figures. And then I'll need to go back after that to the PowerPoint. Thank you. The sound is lower than it should really be, but we were not able to get it up more. Not yet. Let's come to the end. Okay. Can we have the light again, please? Thanks. I got to read this. I didn't memorize it. And then one final image that demonstrates the imbrication of Kentridge's understanding of Africa and Europe as intertwined. A black shadowy female figure walking on damaged stilts west to east across a map of Germany with the Latin names of Roman provinces inscribed on the map, which is a 19th century map representing Central Europe during the Roman Empire. Radical compression of time and space, the contours of the figure's upper body seem to suggest the contours of the map of South Africa itself. Map across map, black across white, an imaginary superimposition which borders deliberately, with borders deliberately crossed and denied. Kentridge calls her the pylon lady. Hannah Arendt and Aimé Césaire once spoke of a boomerang, or respectively of a choc en retour, as they reflected on the relationship between colonialism and the Holocaust. Now there is another boomerang, different but still related to the history of colonialism. As the former colonials amass at the borders of Europe, Europe reacts with pulling up borders, building new walls, and expanding detention centers. but the black is always already part of the white. Light never comes without its shadows. And I should add here perhaps that Doris Salcedo has a new work that is opening in Madrid in early October called Palimpsests, one of the very few successful works, I think, that deal with issues of migration across the Mediterranean. I hope at least it will be that successful. I've only seen some previous images of it, but anyway. So let me come to an end now. What conclusions can finally be drawn from these preceding juxtapositions of these three artists? I might suggest the following. Kentridge, Sundaram, and Salcedo's practices are no longer modernist in a traditional European sense. Classical modernism and avant-gardism appear in this work as memory, citation, and pointed bricolage. There emerges an alternative memorial art practice that may strike us as surprising in its self-conscious coupling of aesthetics and politics. If it is avant-garde at all, it is an avant-gardism quite different in its temporal imagination from that of the historical avant-garde. Avant-gardism here not as a model of progress or utopia, dependent on the experience of shock, as in Benjamin, or on the most advanced cutting-edge state of the artistic material, as in Adorno, or for that matter, on the disavowal of any and all realisms, as in much French post-structuralism, Barthes, Lyotard, Derrida, Kristeva. Avant-gardism rather as a challenge to think politically through spectacular, sensuous installations that create effect both on the local and the global stage. Avant-gardism not as programmatic destruction of traditional notions of autonomy and the work, but as an insistence on the differential specificity of aesthetic work. Given its embeddedness in social and political critique, this work is geared in its aesthetic construction toward disrupting the automatism of allegedly autonomous vision, transparent knowledge, and public opinion. Kentridge, Sundaram, and Salcedo's work thus reinscribes and marks a boundary between artistic practice and all that is part of a presentist visual culture of quick consumption and careless forgetting. Not forgiving, forgetting. In fleeting shadow plays, as in densely material sculptural installations, the remembrance of historical trauma and contemporary politics are aesthetically mediated in such a way that deep structures of domination and social conflict in our world are illuminated for the spectator. In this sense, their work is political through and through. In its formal and technical strategies, it marks a refusal of a technological triumphalism that privileges only the digital and social media. It is no longer a philosophy of history that anchors this kind of avant-gardism, but on the contrary, a sustained doubt in merely technological progress, combined with a political critique of a failing present that has not redeemed the promises of modernity. This avant-gardism from the periphery offers an intriguing paradox. It implodes the distinction between tradition and the avant-garde, since it transforms the critique of modernity, which after all was always already part of European avant-gardism itself, for a post-colonial, globalizing world and its memories of Europe. The social life of memory cannot rely on historical pedagogy, museums, and memorials, all of which are inevitably inscribed with dimensions of power that may limit their effect. It must draw on the power of the arts to embody the dialectic between abstraction and affect. Only then may social institutions of education and culture be energized by this effective dimension of memory politics, which alone they cannot guarantee. Thank you.